short term or the longer term. A new report commissioned by the energy company Drax seeks to outline a practical framework for companies to classify emissions on a number of different axes and to develop robust strategies for carbon dioxide removal deployment or purchases. And we're pleased to have the authors of this report with us today to provide a summary of key findings of the report and recommendations, as well as to answer questions from our audience. So at the outset, let me introduce our presenters. First of all, Josh Burke serves as a distinguished policy fellow with the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and the Environment at the London School of Economics and Political Science. Ingi Johnston serves as in the capacities at the Net Zero Lab and the Max Planck Institute. And finally, Leo Mercer is a policy fellow also at the Grantham Research Institute. Welcome to all of you. As always, we'll begin with a initial intervention by the speakers, and I'll follow this up with a few seating questions, and then we'll move on to audience questions. In that latter context, I encourage you to begin to populate the Q&A box as soon as your questions arise so that I can curate those questions and have a sense of how long we should devote to audience questions at the end. And with that, I will turn over the microphone to Leo.
Can everyone see that, Will? Is that looking?
Yes. You're not in presenter mode though, Leo. Now you are. Great.
No, perfect.
All
Cool.
set.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Yes, and thanks for the introduction, Will. Yeah, I'm Leo Mercer, and I'm going to present the first section of our report, which really looks at how the concept of residual emissions has developed over time. So Drax commissioned carbon counts, as Will indicates, to produce an evidence-based review of residual emissions, and then to consider the implications for corporate net zero targets. So yeah, we really dove into the issue and focused on the development of the concept over time, its connection to modeling and other mitigation pathways, and then the broader social and political issues that influence how residual emissions are defined. We then do our best to translate these into actionable corporate guidance, and have, subsequent to the publication of the report, developed a schematic which fleshes out our ideas a little bit more, which we'll cover at the end. But yeah, to begin by asking why this matters. The level of residuals predetermined in IAMs and other mitigation pathways will determine how much CDR we ultimately need to deploy. And then the scale of CDR required has profound implications for both the health of ecosystems, land available for food production, and then flow-on effects into biomass and energy demand, and then investor and regulatory confidence in net zero claims and what substitution effects there are regarding capital or advocacy displaced from other abatement options. So moving on to the development of the concept over time, we ultimately find that it's a recent entry to the climate lexicon, which was surprising to myself personally. I sort of took I assumed the concept was fairly well established before diving into this research project. So the IPCC first used the term in the fifth assessment report in 2014, where it was mentioned 5 times, but no formal definition was given. Then we have the special report on 1.5 in 2018, where there was a clear pivot away from a net emissions framing where emissions are balanced by the land sink, and towards residuals and CDR framing tied explicitly to climate neutrality. And then by AR6, residual emissions had been operationalized in every scenario that limits warming to 2 degrees or below. And here in the UK, our climate change committee has been using the term since 2010, and there's some fairly well accepted definitions proffered by large reports like the State of CDR reporting cycle. But interestingly, Buck and colleagues who looked at 50 national long-term low emission strategies found no consistent definition. Half of the countries that they looked at in their sample with explicit net zero targets did not attempt to define what they meant by residuals. So there's still a lot of fuzziness going on. So as the literature review progressed, we found it quite interesting to find that there's no universally accepted definition of what residuals are in practice and how countries or corporates should address it. So we grouped the definitions we found into three conceptually distinct framings. So the first is governance oriented. This definition sees residuals as those gross emissions that must be counterbalanced to achieve a net zero balance at the target date. So Smith and colleagues in the first State of CDR report define residuals as the emissions at the point of net zero, irrespective of the difficulty of abatement. The second definition is techno-economic in nature. So here, residuals are emissions where abatement is further along the MAC curve than neutralisation with removals. In AR5, the IPCC uses this logic where CDR is justified to compensate for residual emissions from sectors where mitigation is more expensive. The third grouping, and the most contentious, Josh will expand upon this a little bit later on, is socio-political. And this is the most fuzzy and consequential within climate policy. Here, residuals persist not because they are strictly infeasible, but because they are deemed socially necessary. And Lund and colleagues describe them as being discursively constructed. And finally, across the different jurisdictional definitions, we can see how different countries understand residuals. We have Iceland defining them as unlikely to be eliminated, the US binding them to cost and technical factors, and France embedding temporal elements to their understanding. So closely related to the definitional problem is the actual vocabulary used itself. We see the term residual, hard to abate, ongoing and unavoidable emissions used as if they're synonyms, but there are definite nuances here. So ongoing emissions on the left-hand panel persist during the transition period before you reach net zero. They reflect locked-in capital stock, decarbonisation technologies that are not yet mature, or transitional economic and social constraints. These are the emissions that the country or corporate are actively working on. And then residual emissions on the right, these are different. They persist after maximum feasible abatement. They get labelled hard to abate, technically unavoidable, economically or socially infeasible to eliminate, and in some parts of the literature, recalcitrant. We believe that there's also a temporal distinction to flag. Anticipated residuals of what we expect will remain at net zero based on today's information, but actual residuals of what will really remain in practice, and that is only going to be known in retrospect. So when a corporate publishes a net zero plan with a residuals figure, that's their anticipated residuals figure, not their actual residuals figure. So with that, I'll hand over to Josh now.
Thank you, Leo. So I'm going to talk about how integrated assessment models determine residual emissions. And this is really to illustrate that how residuals come into being, which is that they arise from IAMs and then they become embedded within the discourse. So just for those who aren't familiar with IAMs, they are quantitative frameworks that link energy, economics, land use, and climate systems to map out pathways to 1.5 or 2 degrees. Importantly, the IPCC doesn't necessarily build these models, it just assembles the results from many of them. Then residual emissions become not an input that somebody has necessarily decided on, they're an output of the modeling process. Within that, a central driver is the marginal abatement cost curve, which you see here on the right-hand side. This is a MAC curve from 2007, so one of the first iterations from McKinsey. The logic is fairly straightforward. The cheap abatement options come first, those below the line on the left-hand side, and the expensive measures come later. So low-cost measures like renewables or energy efficiency, they sit on the left. Hard-to-abate sectors like agriculture or heavy industry have typically sat on the right. And one of the new concepts, or kind of breaking down with traditional logic, and this is an argument put forward in the report, is that rather than simply moving up the Mac curve in a linear fashion, this is something that should be avoided. And that's because the Mac curve is a static snapshot. It doesn't necessarily capture what happens after you invest. So the learning rates, the technology spillovers, and network effects. And this Mac curve is a nice example of that. So here it has solar PV looking quite expensive, and it's now the cheapest electricity in history. The question isn't just what's cheapest today, it's what investments made today will minimize the future cost of mitigation. That can mean deploying apparently expensive options, including CDR, before you've exhausted the cheaper ones, because their long run potential is higher. And actually, we're seeing this today. Microsoft and Google are already doing this. They're buying more expensive CDR. So they've moved up the Mac curve in a non-linear fashion. So the implication for an organization building a decarbonization roadmap is start with the low-hanging fruit. That makes sense. But in parallel, identify which higher cost options have the strongest dynamic potential and move on these early. Next slide, please. So which emissions end up as residual in practice? Certain sectors appear again and again, as Leo mentioned, aviation, agriculture, heavy industry, steel, cement, chemicals. For aviation, the energy density required simply can't be matched by low carbon alternatives today at scale. For agriculture, we're dealing with methane, nitrous oxide from livestock and fertilizer, stubborn emissions without obvious technical fixes. For industry, some process can involve chemical reactions that inherently produce CO2, cement and calcination being the classic example. These aren't policy failures per se, they just reflect physical and technical constraints today. But we should be careful not to treat hard to abate as a fixed classification. There are temporal considerations. Some emissions persist because they are technically impossible to eliminate, but not necessarily because they're technically impossible, but because they are socially or politically difficult. Aviation and meter consumption are the most frequently cited examples. And there is a risk that framing certain sectors as inherently residual embeds these value judgments about which emission society suggests we should preserve, and then that risks locking in these rather than challenging them. In the UK, for example, the Climate Change Committee projects that over 3/4 of residual emissions will come from just two sectors, aviation at 35% and agriculture at 41%. And across developed countries more broadly, residual emissions average 18 to 21% of initial emissions in most ambitious national plans. And that's a significant volume. And it actually raises an important question about whether net zero targets are genuinely increasing ambition. That's because under the previous target in the UK, for example, it was 80% emissions reduction. And even though we've moved to a net zero target, we're still only abating 80% and the rest is removed. So it's an important question to ask whether targets are actually increasing ambition. Next slide, please. The temporal dimension of residual emissions is underappreciated, we think, in the whole debate. The first point is about when emissions occur. Cumulative CO2 determines long-term warming, but there is an asymmetry in the climate carbon cycle. An emission raises atmospheric CO2 more effectively than an equivalent removal lowers it. And that means the delay is not neutral. Scenarios that push reductions into the future and rely on CDR later still reach net zero on paper, but they expect higher peak temperatures along the way. And those peak temperatures can have implications for tipping points. The second point is about permanence or durability. Nature-based removals, forestry in particular, are vulnerable to reversal through fire, disease, and land use change. And although geological storage can be more durable, it requires monitoring over a much longer period of time, and we don't necessarily have the institutions at the moment to manage that. The geoscience literature tells us that for removals to be climatically meaningful, they need to be permanent on timescales exceeding 1,000 years to 10,000 years. Using temporary removals to offset permanent fossil is therefore fundamentally non-fungible working on this basis. And IAMs don't capture this well because they're cost-focused and largely indifferent between emissions and equivalent removal. Third, and this is a broader governance concern, the prospect of future CDR can itself reduce near-term political ambition. Researchers have called this a form of moral hazard. If we believe the problem can be fixed later, the urgency to act now diminishes. This is a temporal shifting of responsibility onto future generations, and they don't have a say in that. Next slide, please. And linked to that temporal shifting of responsibility is the distributional concerns, aspects of equity, justice, and unequal burdens. And this operates at every scale from global to domestic. At the global level, IAM scenarios don't prescribe how the burden of residual emissions is shared between countries, but the implicit regional allocation matters enormously. Analysis shows that if the EU, US, and China hold to current NDC pledges under a 2-degree pathway, all remaining countries would need per capita emissions 7 to 14 times lower than those major emitters by 2030. This is not a neutral outcome, it is deeply political. The UNFCCC's principle of common but differentiated responsibilities says that historical emitters should carry greater responsibility. So if we apply that to CDR, that implies that developed nations' fair share of removal should be 2 to 3 times higher than a simple least cost model would suggest. The current pledge and review process is not designed to operationalize that principle. There's a further access gap around CDR, which compounds this. DACs and BECs require capital, technical expertise, and geological storage, and they're all unevenly distributed. Developed countries offsetting their residuals with engineered CDR, while developing countries lack equivalent access, creates a new dimension of carbon inequality. And land-based approaches like afforestation can directly compete with food security in the global south. And finally, domestically carbon pricing revenue without recycling can be regressive. That's a well-known issue, and that can place disproportionate burdens on lower income households. So the question of who pays for hard-to-abate mitigation and CDR deployment remains politically unresolved and under-theorized in most modelling frameworks. These are really important concerns that will shape political feasibility of any serious net zero strategy. And over to Inji.
Thanks so much, Josh. And if we could head to the next slide, please, Leo. Wonderful. So part of this analysis was top-down, as you could see. So really interrogating what the IAMs suggest in terms of residual emissions, what kind of factors do they consider? But another component of the report really looked at a bottom-up approach from the perspective of corporate climate action. As we know, this is one of the hard edges of residual emissions in practice, and it was a really interesting exercise to look from this perspective at this issue. As we know, corporate climate action has undergone a very significant transformation over the past decade, in particular in response to net zero. We're seeing a growing number of pledges, and increasingly we're seeing real challenges in how those pledges translate to practice, in part because to progress towards your net zero target, you need to understand not only the net, but also working on that zeroing in on those emissions. And so, we've seen a number of strategies in how corporates have dealt with this. We have seen the incidence of science-based pathways to achieve net zero, the most famous example being, of course, SBTIs. We have seen a growing appreciation on the importance of minimizing your direct emissions before relying on offsetting. And perhaps more nascently, we're also seeing growing awareness in carbon dioxide removal becoming an essential component of treating your waste. So the carbon cost of doing business is increasingly being factored in. But all these factors really do differ on an individual basis for corporates. And so this exercise is really trying to look from that bottom-up perspective as to what kinds of things have been factoring into what can be a very complex judgment call. Next slide, please. Great. So as part of this, we did a stock take of a number of potential sources of insights into this question. This is just a short excerpt. The table in the report is much more detailed, but just to say that as we found with IAMs, we also saw that the definition of residual emissions does differ depending on the standard. We also saw that there was different approaches to actually deciding what is residual. So we saw some that sought to put some more quantitative thresholds in place, whereas others took a more qualitative approach to deciding what is residual. For instance, evidence that emissions cannot be eliminated. And then, of course, that's just the first two steps. The third one is really integral, and that's concerning the treatment of residual emissions. So what do you do once you've identified that you have them? What kind of steps do you take? And interestingly, as we'll touch upon at the end of today's presentation, already this is starting to change. So residual emissions are increasingly being seen not only as something to deal with at that net zero target date and beyond, but increasingly in the near term as well. Next slide, please. So in terms of deciding what is residual for corporates, it's very clear that if individual corporates are left to their own devices at the level of a sustainability officer or whatnot, it's very easy to potentially overestimate or otherwise get residual emissions volumes wrong. This is why it's really important to collaborate, not only in the development of the residual emissions estimates, but also beyond in terms of what kind of signal that corporates are actually sending beyond their four walls to the innovation environment, including that that can be stimulated by governments and as well civil society. But of course, that first step is really rooted in the greenhouse gas inventory. So that's to get a really good stock take of what emissions are today and as a basis for tracking emissions as they evolve through 2030 and beyond. Then it's really important to identify what the key emission sources are, and as part of this, what are the marginal abatement cost curves associated with this? Again, because we see residual emissions definitions sometimes including that cost element, it's really important to also factor that in and get a really precise estimate of what that could look like. Again, acknowledging that this can look different by corporates as well by sectors. And then there's a number of different dimensions of judgment that we've seen exhibited. Everything from what kind of technological readiness level a technology may exhibit, its accessibility, particularly its potential to integrate within supply chains, its economic feasibility, so its costs, as well as aspects such as socio-political constraints that could be at play. These could be both reception by a customer base, but they could also be related to legislative or regulatory requirements as well. Next slide, please. And so we started to probe what really is the starting point of our more operational guidance in the report. So again, this emphasis on prioritizing mitigation. It's very clear, no matter what exercise you look to define residual emissions, that it's incredibly important to really hone in on only those that have to be abated. And so that can look like a number of things, both within your value chain. It can focus on, or it can look like investing in research and development. It can look like implementing innovative insetting projects throughout your value chain, and increasingly also applying some form of internal carbon pricing, to drive further investment. Beyond your value chain, of course, there's other options, including procuring carbon removal credits following the Oxford offsetting principles. And as well, we've seen really interesting innovations in terms of companies growing bio consortium together and really starting to understand what it could look like to support a shared and common infrastructure for CDR, everything from MRV to procurement. Next slide, please. And finally, before I hand over to Josh, just one other aspect that we uncovered in this report. So residual emissions are not just important for reaching that net zero target or just as a modeling exercise. They can, of course, cause increased costs. So delaying action to identify your residual emissions and take neutralization steps can make those solutions more inaccessible. It could also mean that your corporate is ineligible to meet certain standards that are emerging and are best practice. It can, of course, cause a loss of confidence in consumers or indeed investors in some jurisdictions if that becomes part and parcel of responsible business practice. Of course, failing to address your residual emissions contributes to the CDR gap, which we know is significant and growing. So, between the 2 billion tons of CO2 deployment we see today towards the 7 to 9 gigatons that we need by mid-century, there's a significant gap, and every step that we take by not addressing residual emissions contributes to that. And of course, linked to that, this increasing notion of carbon debt. Now, that's important not just for existential reasons, but also increasingly as we see the uptick in climate litigation, that can also create quite a risk on a corporate balance sheet over time and in certain jurisdictions. So overall, it's really clear that addressing your residual emissions today not only reduces risks and builds confidence, but really helps equip your corporate for the net zero standards of tomorrow as well. With that, I'll pass over to Josh. Thanks.
Thanks, Angie. Okay, so this is probably a bit hard to read, but we had a go at putting together a decision tree to operationalize how a corporate might identify residual emissions. And this is based on one of the central findings from the report, that there's no agreed definition of residual emissions. So the starting point for us was, rather than think of a single catch-all category, instead we classify emissions across 2 dimensions, how difficult they are to abate and over what time frame. And then this gives you 3 working categories: near-term abatable, medium-term abatable, with plausible technology development, and long-term removal dependent. But critically, this isn't a static definition or process. Emissions are expected to migrate between categories as factors change. So if we start with the decision tree here, we have remaining emissions at the first gate, residual emissions. And if the emissions in the inventory, we say yes. And can it be abated today? If the answer is no, is there a credible future pathway? And if the answer to no is that, it's long-term removal dependent. If the answer to that is yes, then it's medium-term abatable. If, when we're back at can it be abated today, the answer is yes, the next gate is the abatement at a reasonable cost? If the answer is no, are there other if the answer is yes, then the next consideration is whether other barriers are at play, whether that's political or social. And then moving on from that, if the answer, if there are other barriers at play, we want to understand whether they persist over time. And if they don't, if the other barriers aren't at play, the next question to ask is whether the capital stock, there's appropriate turnover in capital stock. And if there is, then they can be near-term abatable. So this is a very simplistic and untested decision tree that we put together. And this is the first time we've put it out there just for spark a bit of discussion. But we thought it was a nice way of trying to, in a very simple way, conceptualize how one might go about thinking through the categories we put together. And then from this, it drives a lot of the recommendations that I'll come to now. Next slide. Thank you, Leo. So, as I said, the starting point was that there's no agreed definition, and using that framework, the first step in our 5-step framework is to distinguish, and this is to distinguish between categories temporally and whether they're long-term dependent on CDR. So that goes back to the decision tree. Then identify the relevant corporate standards, understand sectoral IAM treatment, ensure Paris consistency, integrate carbon pricing, and differentiate your different barriers. So distinguish is the first step for a corporate. That then is followed by plan, so create an emissions baseline and transparent boundary conditions, study the levers that could reclassify residuals over time. Then this becomes an exercise in disclosure. So map and disclose the materiality of emissions in each step under TCFD, align transition disclosure rules. And then a corporate should take action, address the factors that keep emissions in the medium and long-term categories, optimize the CDR procurement strategy today, support the creation of CDR policies and transmission infrastructure, and then finally establish reporting processes that distinguish between emissions categories. And this is a circular framework that then goes back into distinguish and so on. And this should be updated over time. And then I think that's it from us on the report, but INGI has, as this is a very rapidly evolving space, things have even changed since we put this together. So INGI's got some very final reflections on things that have changed since we put this out.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks, Josh. So in essence, as you can see here, really the only constant is change. And so that's why it's really important that actors, whether from the private or public sector, really do take this opportunity to grapple with what residual emissions mean for them. And this is as part of what we advocated, that this concept of regular revision is really key as part of that. We also unpacked in the report quite a number of distribution mechanisms for how these residual emissions could be differentiated and implemented out in the world. And increasingly, this is important because we see a number of international frameworks evolving, whether it's Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, CORSIA, and the International Maritime Organization, or even developments between the Emissions Trading Scheme and the CBAM that is causing these ripple effects across borders. But what's really interesting, and just to close with the very latest, including what was updated at London Climate Week is some of the changes to the standards that we're seeing. So as you recall, as part of this exercise was to interrogate what current standards said about residual emissions. And what's really interesting is even in the short few months since the release of the report, we have seen that start to shift and some more clarity about what best practice looks like moving forward. Next slide, please. So first up here, we have the release of the new corporate net zero standard by the SBTi. Now, this introduces a distinction between ongoing emissions, residual emissions, and ongoing emissions responsibility. It further defines residual emissions and importantly, also mandates for the first time tangible steps to reaching that neutralization target. So again, no longer are residual emissions just the preserve of that net zero target date or beyond. They are something that has to actively be addressed in a mandatory sense, at least from 2035 for category A companies. So encourage everyone to look at that revised standard and practically consider what that means. What's really interesting is the recent ISO Net Zero Organizations Standard 14060 actually goes a bit further into the detail of residual emissions. So it actually introduces a much more structured methodology for how to identify and periodically reassess your residual emissions. It actually introduces this concept, which is the same methodology we undertook in this report, of both looking at the top-down pathways as well as bottom-up feasibility analysis. And again, similar to SBTi, it requires that advanced planning for counterbalancing residual emissions. And indeed, really recognizes that residual emissions are dynamic, revisable, and evidence-based, and not this fixed category that perhaps otherwise may be assumed. And it's also interesting because, as we said, the inventory really remains the foundation of course, emissions reporting. And as part of that, actually, the new developments in terms of the actions and market instruments working group could further solidify that. So again, we have or can expect perhaps an even greater separation of one's physical inventory, as well as recognition as to what market-based steps, including neutralization efforts, corporates are undergoing as part of that. So with this kind of landscape, we can see very much that residual emissions are increasing in importance, and actually corporates as well are getting more guidance from the standards as to how to deal with them. So really emphasizing why it's important to think about residual emissions now and not just at our net zero target date. Thanks.
We lost Will.
Oh no. I guess I can see a question in the the chat box. So perhaps we tackle that. So I'll read it out. How did you engage with the question of luxury emissions? So emissions associated with things that are not socially necessary, such as space tourism. How should such emissions feature in legitimate residuals, or do we need some way to identify and eliminate such emissions, even if it means eliminating those activities? Leo or Josh, do you want to kick off first with some thoughts?
Yeah, happy to have the first stab at this. I'm sure we all have our own personal opinion about whether or not space tourism is a legitimate use of our remaining emissions budget. But I guess the key thing from sort of the groupings of definitions we found is that it's we, I guess, as society, define what we think are legitimate residual emissions. We Our revealed preference is largely by our voting patterns and the politicians we vote in, who then make the policies um, um, for climate change, whether for good or for bad. So yeah, I don't know if anyone wants to take another stab at that.
Yeah, I guess just to add that this kind of, because we were surveying the literature of things to date, we were only really looking at emissions from sectors that are socially preferable to remain. So flying, aviation, etc. Space tourism isn't something that necessarily crops up very regularly in the literature, or so I know that's just an example here, but those kinds of things aren't necessarily that well discussed in the report. It was more from the perspective of things that missions that remain from the perspective of maintaining broad coalitions of support for governments, or things that might not result in huge opposition to climate change measures. So if there was a strong push for governments to determine the amount of flying or the type of diets that might need to be mandated, those are the kinds of things we were looking at.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to add, so, really through interrogating this concept of residual emissions became very clear, again, that it isn't a neutral term, right? It's very laden with our values that we put on it from a societal perspective, and actually surfacing some of those judgment calls being made, whether through the IAM models or on an individual basis for corporates, is actually part of really starting to have much more active and dynamic questions raised about legitimate emissions, and not only kind of demand side measures, but also those supply side efforts to neutralize emissions. Welcome back, Will.
Apologies for that. We're having massive storms in Chicago, and turned off my computer. So anyway, let's see. Have we gone to audience questions already?
Yeah, we just kicked off with a couple from the Q&A box.
Okay. So I'll encourage everybody, obviously, to continue to populate that box, but maybe I'll ask you a couple of questions, hoping I don't get disconnected again anytime soon. One question I had was,
Oh no. Should we take a stab with the other one in the interim?
Yeah.
Um, so would there be any considerations for residual emissions reductions that have co-benefits, for example, biochar and House rock weathering BECCS over DAC or bikers? Josh, Angie, you want to take a stab?
Yeah, I mean the report itself was agnostic from a CDR technology perspective, so we weren't really looking at or comparing between different CDR methods and the co-benefits. Obviously, certain CDR methods have more co-benefits, but they also come with other drawbacks, such as not necessarily storing carbon for as long as some of the other methods for. So the report really doesn't tackle this question directly.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I mean, as we found in the State of CDR report, so the latest version just last month, we really do need all CDR tools in the toolkit. And so whilst co-benefits are particularly helpful for say selling credits on the voluntary carbon market in the meantime, I really think, and especially the size of residual emissions that we're facing, that we can't limit pathways at this stage. However, it is really important again, to look fully at both the co-benefits and the risks associated with each pathway, because again, that just reinforces why it's so important to really preserve our finite supply of carbon removal for the emissions that we know we need to counterbalance, because they'll still be residual at that net zero date. Leo, do you have any thoughts on this as well?
Yeah, no, not yeah, I agree wholeheartedly with what you both said. But I can also see we are out of audience Q&A questions. So if anyone has any others they want to put in the chat box, we'll be happy to answer.
Yeah, for instance, or a question for the audience also as to whether you've encountered different definitions of residual emissions and or what impact would defining residual emissions in a more dynamic manner have on your work, wherever you're coming from it in terms of the standpoint. We can also give a further update that we're planning on building on this report in terms of turning it into a journal article. So if there's also feedback about what would be most helpful, questions to answer as part of that, that would also be helpful for us. We've got a question here from Toby Bryce. Nice to see you, Toby. Can you restate the argument against companies and organizations using the mitigation method that is the cheapest reduction or removal, and where you come out on this question? So again, I mean, this is what's interesting about looking at this domain of residual emissions, both from this top-down and bottom-up perspective, because when you're looking from the bottom-up perspective, it's very easy to look at that least cost method and justify a strategy for net zero or otherwise around that. However, the issue is the coordination problem. So really, this need to reach net zero emissions overall at the global scale to halt that cumulative emissions in the atmosphere, we need to transition to durable removals for all residual emissions. And part and parcel of that is recognizing that some actors and sectors and particular sources of emissions have much more potential to do abatement today than others. And so that would be the kind of starting point for why it's important to consider these different factors at play rather than rushing just to that least cost option. But yeah, curious as to other thoughts on that too.
Yeah, I can chip in. So one of the things we talked about in the report is how a corporate might look at a map curve, which is a very static process and static snapshot. So if you think about endogenous growth proponents, they would suggest that sometimes it's actually better to start with the more expensive stuff to give it that kind of kickstart, to kickstart the kind of the green industrial revolution, or in kickstart the revolution in those technologies that might have a disproportionate effect. So there's a really good underlying paper to this argument, which is, I think, it's called "Where Starting with the Most Expensive Makes Sense," or something to that effect. And that's something we wanted to get across in the report. Yes, start with some of the low-hanging fruit, but actually the spillovers and the network effects can actually be much greater when you take into account or invest in more expensive technologies. They might have a much larger effect than they might appear today because you're just looking at the static costs. So thinking about things more dynamically is one way about thinking through how to invest on technologies across the curve, because they have much larger long run potential. So we've also got a question from Martin. I'm curious if your research points to being able to have a common definition of residual emissions across greenhouse gases. Would residual emissions for CO2 be similar to residual emissions for methane, for example?
I can take a stab at this. And yeah, I guess we would we would envisage a similar process as we outlined across different greenhouse gases. And I guess, yeah, take methane, for example, in agriculture, there may be success with a methane vaccine. We may see more methane suppressing feed products rolled out, and much lower emissions from agriculture consequently. But at this point in time, those are every time I read a new report, it's always for a vaccine at least a decade away into the future. So we would, and that's obviously comparable for different industrial processes where CO2 is the main emission. So yeah, similar process across GHGs.
Yeah, it's interesting. Actually, Leo and I both come from New Zealand, where the government has chosen to adopt a split target. So one definition for CO2 emissions in terms of reaching that net, and then an alternative for methane emissions. And so I think that is an example where there has been heterogeneity in terms of response. But I also think it's a really interesting question, because I think in part it also comes down to, how diverse we have in terms of the sources of methane, and potential questions about whether the methane emissions are more justified from a societal perspective because they're related more to agriculture or to waste management and whatnot in comparison to say, fossil emissions. Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question. Josh, do you have any thoughts on that as well?
Nothing further, but I can take a stab at the next question. So Dan Galpin asks, what is the connection, if any, between your efforts to get a handle on residual emissions and the larger need to deal with legacy emissions, that is, those already released to the atmosphere over the decades from unrestricted activities? So we tried to address this in the paper in the section around distributional implications and equity and the unequal burden of CDR. So there's a link in the sense that the IEM scenarios don't necessarily prescribe how residual emissions should be shared between countries. But it's enormously important if you think about the countries who have been polluting for longest. They are typically the most developed countries. So there's a strong argument I would make that those countries have a larger responsibility for removing historic activities. But that's not what we find in a lot of the NDC pledges. So those countries or jurisdictions that have a much larger responsibility are actually not putting forward plans that are commensurate with that. So that's something that needs to be redressed. And INGI's done a lot of work on carbon removal budgeting, so maybe that's something that could be used to allocate a fair share of responsibility under those principles.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, no matter the extent that even, some sectors have already blown through potential, carbon budgets and are infringing upon others, it will always be possible to better track that and to account and take stock for that. And I think that's one of the beauties around really unpacking that fundamental distinction between emissions and removals, and particularly in terms of that net zero transition and this real acknowledgement that we need to not only reach net zero, but to go to a net negative state to avoid overshoot, and to really to bring temperatures back down. So I think those kinds of questions will become increasingly key. I think the closer to net zero we get, and I think we'll start casting our minds back even further in terms of that responsibility, particularly if we see this integrated into a track of negotiations under the UNFCCC. It's been contentious in the past, but we really could get to the state that really, in terms of neutralization effort, these things will have to be apportioned relative to who caused the damage. Thanks.
Welcome back, Will, if you're with us.
Yes, I'm on my phone if everyone can hear me. I can't see the Q&A box. Are there any other questions there immediately? If not, I have a couple.
We've answered everything to
Okay.
date.
Okay. So one thing I'm curious about, and I don't think it was addressed in the study, but given your expertise, I'm interested in your opinion. In a lot of the standards that we see, including SBTI and Oxford, and I believe IPCC, they talk about in defining residual emissions the question of whether it is quote unquote feasible, right, to decarbonize in a specific sector, and they talk about different axes, including political and technological and economic. And one question I had is, do any of these standards have a definition of economic feasibility? For example, if it would cost 20% more, for example, to decarbonize a sector such as steel, and CDR would be cheaper, does that make it per se uh, infeasible for that sector? What is the threshold that you've seen, or if there isn't a threshold, should there be one? Because I would think all the time industry would say, well, it's infeasible because it's more expensive to do, or it's more expensive than CDR.
Yeah, I think it's a really great point. And I mean, interestingly, I guess in some ways with SPTI, we've walked away from, quantitative, volumes of residual emissions or kind of projected residual emissions to a much more open system where more of that judgment call is left to an individual corporate. I know SBTI had expounded a bit on what they mean in terms of feasibility in the latest standard. And I can read it out. It refers to what's technically and commercially achievable on reasonable terms relative to sector norms, considering available technologies, market conditions, and credible leading practices. So inbuilt within there, I think that sector norms one is really important, because margins vary significantly across sectors, as we know. And so I think it would be really interesting, and I think a few others like Robert Hoagland have done this kind of assessment to really look at, compensation on a profit per ton basis. And so I think that would be one of the first steps to that. Sorry, but did you want to come in?
No, I thought that was interesting. Others have thoughts?
No, nothing from me.
Okay. Uh, another question I had is you suggest at some point in the study that that there could be biases on the part of corporations in terms of how they define residuals for, self-serving purposes, obviously. Um, and you suggested that there's been some discussion of establishing standards, right? And do you think that in the long term, we should have national or maybe more importantly, international standards that define residual emissions and drive this process rather than leaving it to individual corporations?
Happy to take a stab at this, but yeah, I can imagine we're all in agreement that we need a more active role for national governments and then multilateral processes to establish the rules and the frameworks and the reporting processes. Because, yeah, as we can see, when corporates um, set their own targets and mark their own homework, we get some often substandard results. And yeah, I think there's a clear role for intergovernmental cooperation on this, hugely significant from a climate perspective issue. Yeah.
Right.
Abs-
Yeah, go
Absolutely. And I
ahead.
think, yeah, I think it's something that can really become a compounding problem really easily, with scope three emissions. And so
Right.
if everyone's scope one is being
Yeah.
very optimistic in terms of where they could land by 2050, and then you project that to scope three, and then you're trying to take those steps to neutralize 1% of your residual emissions and so on and so forth, you can, yeah, really end up miles off track, I think. And so that's why that recalibration recommendation is really important to kind of to treat them as a dynamic baseline that's evolving.
Right. And do you think ultimately, I think Josh was talking about it being done at an international level. Do you think it needs to be done at an international level rather than a national level? Because one concern I have is that countries might try to protect their own industries by establishing standards that were different than what other countries would have, and that could be problematic in the long term.
Yeah, I mean, I think administratively it could be done at the national level. I don't necessarily think you need a governance architecture uh, at such a high level, but definitely the definition should be agreed through some common international body or practice. Otherwise, you get uh, certain interests lobbying hard for more permissive definitions, which then obviously inflate the need for CDR. So I think you need an internationally agreed definition, but you could have domestic implementation or domestic governance structures. So one of the ongoing discussions in the UK is about the need for a carbon regulator. So the regulator in the UK, for example, could be the type of apparatus that is used to ensure that the internationally agreed definitions are being complied with
Mhm.
and robustly reported against.
Right. Do you think Paris might be the logical province for the international standard, given the incorporation of CDR increasingly in NDCs?
Yeah, I think it could be also the IPCC are
Hmm.
running the current definition of what CDR is and the accounting methodologies for certain carbon removal methods that don't currently exist within the current framework. So that might be another forum for this discussion as well.
Great. All right. Well, thank you very much. Once again, my apologies. I'm literally in the dark here, and I'm sorry that we had these problems. But I thank all of you for carrying on during this, and it sounded like it was a good discussion. And so once again, I'd like to thank all three of our speakers today, Josh, Ingi, and Leo. I'd like to thank our audience members for their thoughtful questions. And I hope that you will join us for our next episode, which will be on August 11th. In the words of Monty Python, this will be something completely different. We will be looking at atmospheric methane removal and the potential role of new legislation in the United States to try to facilitate that. Still consistent with our scrubbing the skies theme, but not with a focus on carbon removal, but obviously with pertinence in terms of the portfolio of responses we think about in the context of climate change. So I encourage you to register for that webinar and join us. And so with that, once again, thanks everyone, and goodbye for now.